Nobody deserved more to serve as one of the first consuls of Rome than Callatinus. And in fact, when the king was removed, that is Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Callatinus was appointed alongside Brutus to serve as the first two consuls of Rome. However, he was forced to resign soon after his appointment because of his name. I welcome you to my YouTube channel where I explore ancient texts, and ancient texts here I mean texts that have been around for thousands of years. I try to find interesting stories in those texts. At the moment I'm going through a book from the founding of the city by Titus Livius or Livy. This is a collection of books actually that were written about 2000 years ago, and they cover the history of Rome from around 750 BCE when Romulus founded the city to around 0 AD or 0 BCE when the writer passed on. Subscribe so that you don't miss any of the videos that I upload. The first consuls retained all the powers of the king, basically. They were not kings, but they exercised those powers to some extent. But they ruled as two individuals, and they were called the consuls. Being two individuals, of course, can bring challenges if the two are treated as equals. The Romans agreed that at every time, one of the two needed to have the symbols of power, basically, like having some powers more than the other consul. And how this was decided most of the time was just a conversation that the two consuls will have and decide who among the two will have those symbols of power and exercise some particular sovereign power. Now, the Brutus and Callatinus, it turns out that Brutus was the first to take on these responsibilities, and this was through an agreement that happened between them. Using these, Brutus did a few things. Among the things he did, he made citizens take an oath that they were not going to let Lucius Tarquinius Superbus come back. In particular, that they were not going to allow themselves to be bribed. Seems like bribing was something that was a huge concern for Brutus and people in power at that time. He also appointed more senators to make the total number 300. Remember, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus had killed most of the senators and didn't bother to replace them. Brutus comes to power, and one of the things he decides to do first is to appoint new senators and to make the number 300 so that the decision making of the city is more robust. He also created an office that went by the title King for Sacrifices. This is a very interesting position that Brutus creates, and it's because of some particular reasons that he decides to create this office. And the reason is, since the time of the founding of the city, there were religious functions that could only be performed by the king and nobody else. And if the responsibilities were given to somebody who was not the king, it could have been viewed as disrespect to the gods. Now, the city has become a republic. Basically, now they don't have a king, but they are still practicing the same religion, so there are still the same expectations. So Brutus decided that so that those functions will be performed by somebody who is a king but not really a king, he creates an office of the King for Sacrifices. And this is an individual whose functions were only to perform those rites of the king used to perform during the monarchy period. But Brutus and the Senate, of course, made sure that this person will serve under the Pontifex Maximus, who was the high priest. So it's this king who is basically a king to do religious functions, but falls under the office of the high priest. So that's one of the things that Brutus does. Brutus also does something else that became an historical moment for the city. And that is, he led the state in putting pressure on his fellow consul, that is Callatinus, to resign. This is very interesting because Callatinus sacrificed a lot, and it was the injury done to Callatinus, the assault of his wife Lucretia by Sextus, and her subsequent death, that triggered the revolution that ended the reign of the kings in Rome. Callatinus, alongside his father-in-law Spurius Lucretius and Publius Valerius, sacrificed him. So he really deserved to be a consul, and there was no doubt that he was an honorable person, and there was no doubt that he was patriotic, and he didn't have anything really he was thinking of doing to harm the city. Nevertheless, the people started having these conversations about his name. And the reason these conversations were happening is because some people thought while the Tarquins had left the city, the Tarquins were still in power, which technically was the case indeed, because Callatinus' full name is Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. And that is because He is the great-grandson of Demaratus, and Demaratus was the father of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, and Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the father of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. In fact, Collatinus was the nephew of Superbus. People were worried that he had ambitions of grabbing power and becoming the next Tarquin king, or because he was the nephew of Superbus, maybe he was likely to help Superbus come back to Rome and claim his throne. So people had those doubts about him, and that's why Brutus had to call an assembly to discuss it. It is interesting, though, that people ignore the same facts about Brutus. Remember that Brutus was also a nephew of Superbus. He was the son of the sister of Superbus, who went by the name Tarquinia. But the people decided to focus on Collatinus being the nephew of Superbus, and they ignored Brutus being the nephew of Superbus. Of course, we can say the reason that was the case is that while Collatinus, his father came from that family, for Brutus it is the mother. It seems like Romans counted somebody's family from their father's side, not their mother's side. So that's what happened. But basically, the two of them were nephews of Superbus. Brutus summons an assembly to discuss this matter because there was this growing rumors around town about Collatinus. When the assembly is on, this is what Brutus tells Collatinus. These apprehensions it is for you, Lucius Tarquinius, to banish of your own free will. We have not forgotten, I assure you, that you expel the king's family, complete your good work, and remove their very name. Your fellow citizens will, on my authority, not only hand over your property, but if you need anything, they will add to it with lavish generosity. Go as our friend, relieve the Commonwealth from a perhaps groundless fear. Men are persuaded that only with the family will the tyranny of Tarquins depart. So Brutus tells Collatinus that yes, we recognize what you did for this city. We know you played a major role in getting rid of Superbus from power. But at the same time, there are these concerns about your family and your connection to Superbus. So people are not comfortable you being a consul. And Collatinus was hesitant. That's what Livy tells us. He was hesitant initially. It seemed like he wanted to fight for his right to be a Roman and to be a consul. But that changed when his father-in-law, that is Spurius Lucretius, intervened. And Spurius Lucretius was able to persuade him to resign, and he accepted to resign. And in fact, he took everything he owned and he moved to Lanuvian, which was a town not very far from Rome. And after Collatinus has resigned, Brutus leads the senators and the public to pass a decree that forced everyone who was related to the Tarquin family into exile. Interesting, though, Brutus wasn't part of that, even though he was a relative of the Tarquins. The Senate and the Assembly appointed Publius Valerius to replace Collatinus. Valerius was in the first group of people who started the revolution against the king. The threat the people feared Collatinus to pose, the house of Brutus posed, which became apparent in due time. In fact, the threat they feared will come from the family of Collatinus came from the family of Brutus, and we are going to look at that in the next video.